12 men crossed back into camp after 40 days away. They were sent to survey the land, its cities, its terrain, its defenses, its people. They return carrying the agricultural wealth of the valley, pomegranates, figs, and a heavy branch bearing a single cluster of grapes, suspended on a pole between two men to keep the fragile fruit from bruising on the long trek back. 10 of the 12 deliver a report that stops the assembly cold. The land is everything they were promised, they say, flowing with milk and honey. But the people who live there are powerful. Their cities are large and walled. And then, the detail that breaks the congregation open. We saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Enoch, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. The people weep through the night. A generation turns back from the border of the promised land and spends 40 years in the wilderness because of those words. But the word they used, Nephilim, had already appeared once before in the Hebrew text, in a passage 4 verses long, a passage that introduces these beings without explanation, hints at origins that have baffled interpreters for millennia, and then moves on as if it had said something unremarkable. What did it actually say? And what did it mean? This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, Genesis 6:1-4, the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the beings the Hebrew Bible calls the Nephilim, what the text actually says, what ancient interpreters made of it, and why 4 of the most debated verses in Scripture have never stopped demanding an answer. To feel the strangeness of Genesis 6:1-4, you need to feel the literary world it arrives in. Genesis opens with an ordered creation, light and darkness divided, waters separated, life given its proper domains. The chapters that follow trace a succession of generations from Adam through Seth down to Noah. Lifespans are recorded, descendants are named. The moral trajectory bends downward, expulsion from Eden, the first murder, the spreading shadow of death. But the world being described is recognizably a human world. The characters are people, the events are earthly, however tragic, the terms are comprehensible. Then Genesis 6 opens with a shift. The earliest readers of Genesis inhabited a world already deeply preoccupied with what happens when the line between the divine and the human fails to hold. The Mesopotamian royal courts and literary traditions of the ancient Near East, the world Abraham's family left behind when they departed Ur of the Chaldeans, were saturated with accounts of semi-divine heroes born of divine fathers and human mothers, of great catastrophes that followed cosmic disorder, of gods who intervened in human affairs and boundaries that could not hold. These were not obscure stories. They were part of the cultural air the earliest readers of Genesis breathed. When Genesis 6 introduces the sons of God, it steps into that ancient and intense fascination, and then, almost immediately, refuses to offer the explanations its original audience might have expected. Genesis 6 opens that question, and then, almost immediately, declines to answer it. The passage opens with a statement of demographic fact. As humanity multiplied across the face of the earth, daughters were born to them. Then come the 4 verses that have generated centuries of argument. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took as wives whichever ones they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. 4 verses. No identification of the sons of God. No physical description of the Nephilim. No account of what became of them. The narrative shifts directly into the Lord observing the wickedness of humanity and determining to send the flood. These beings appear, are briefly acknowledged, and are gone. The first and most fundamental question the text raises is the one it refuses to answer. Who are the sons of God? In Hebrew, the phrase is bene ha-elohim, literally, sons of the Elohim, sons of God. The same expression appears in 3 other places in the Hebrew Bible, twice in the opening chapters of Job, and once in Job chapter 38. In every one of those passages, the bene ha-elohim are clearly not human beings. They are members of what the text of Job describes as the heavenly court, beings who present themselves before God, who exist in the divine realm, who were present at the laying of the earth's foundations. The parallel usage is consistent and unambiguous. In those texts, this phrase refers to heavenly beings, not people. This reading, that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are divine or semi-divine beings who crossed into the human world, is the oldest interpretation on record. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures produced by Jewish scholars beginning in the 3rd century BC, assumes it. The Jewish writers of the Second Temple period, the roughly 500 years running from the return of the exiles from Babylon through to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, assumed it almost universally. For the earliest readers and interpreters of this text, the sons of God were not a metaphor. They were beings from outside the human order. But that reading generated serious difficulties for later interpreters. If beings from the divine realm could descend, take human wives, and father children, what did that imply about creation's structure, about divine sovereignty, about the nature of those beings? By the early centuries of the Christian era, an alternative interpretation had begun to gain significant ground, one that resolved the theological discomfort by keeping everything within the human world. On this second reading, the sons of God are the righteous descendants of Seth, Adam's 3rd son and the line through whom God's purposes would eventually move. The daughters of men are the daughters of Cain's corrupted line. The sin the passage describes on this reading is not supernatural transgression, but spiritual compromise. The covenant line intermarrying with the ungodly, the faithful community diluted from within. The result is the moral collapse that precedes the flood. This interpretation was developed by early church writers and given its most sustained defense by Augustine of Hippo in the early 5th century AD, in his major work, The City of God. It became the dominant reading in much of Christian theology across many centuries. It has the real advantage of avoiding the difficult implications of divine human reproduction. But it carries a significant textual problem. Genesis does not use these terms this way anywhere else in the text. The sons of God are not identified as Sethites. The daughters of men are not identified as the line of Cain. The distinction the reading depends on is not present in the Hebrew. A third interpretation, less widely known but with its own scholarly advocates, reads bene ha-elohim as human rulers, powerful kings or chieftains who within the political theology of the ancient Near East held a kind of semi-divine status. On this reading, the passage is describing the tyranny of early dynastic kingship, men of power taking women by force, operating without constraint, the unchecked accumulation of dominance producing a world soaked in violence. The wickedness that provokes the flood is, in this frame, the corruption of political power. Three interpretations, each with serious scholarly support. The text itself adjudicates between none of them. Now to the word at the center of it all. Nephilim appears exactly twice in the entire Hebrew Bible, here in Genesis 6:4, and in Numbers 13:33, the passage with which this episode began, where the Israelite spies identify what they saw in Canaan as the Nephilim, the sons of Enoch, and describe themselves as grasshoppers by comparison. The etymology of the word is genuinely disputed. The most widely proposed derivation links it to the Hebrew root naphal, to fall, which would produce a meaning something like the fallen ones, or perhaps those who cause others to fall, or warriors who fall upon their enemies in battle. But the grammatical form of Nephilim does not align cleanly with what we would expect from a regular derivation from naphal, and a number of scholars have questioned whether the link holds. Others have proposed that Nephilim simply means the mighty ones or the great ones, with no etymological connection to falling at all. What is clear is how the Greek-speaking translators of the Septuagint rendered the word gigantes. In classical Greek, gigantes did not primarily denote physically oversized human beings. It referred to the mythological offspring of Uranus and Gaia, of heaven and earth, the beings who waged war against the Olympian gods and were ultimately defeated. The translators were reaching for a Greek category that captured the sense of beings born from the union of the divine and the earthly. Whether physical scale was part of what they intended, the Greek term alone cannot resolve. But the English word giant, which comes down through this translation, carries connotations of bodily size that the original Greek term did not necessarily require. That rendering has shaped popular reading of this passage ever since. The Hebrew Bible's broader tradition includes a cluster of peoples associated with unusual power and formidable size: the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, and the Emim. These groups appear across Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Samuel, connected to the pre-Israelite inhabitants of the land and eventually overcome by Israel and its allies. Deuteronomy 3:11 describes the bed of Og, king of Bashan, a ruler the text connects to the Rephaim, as measuring 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. At a standard cubit of approximately 18 inches, that is around 13.5 feet in length. Whether this refers to a sleeping bed, a ceremonial or funerary structure, or is a figure of rhetorical exaggeration, is a question scholars have proposed in all 3 directions, and the text does not settle it. What this tradition establishes is a recurring preoccupation with primordial peoples of great power dwelling in the land before Israel's arrival and being driven out. The Nephilim of Genesis 6 feed into that larger theme. These too were the mighty men, the men of renown, but the connection is gestured at rather than explained. And then there is the Book of Enoch. First Enoch is a Jewish text that survives in complete form only in Ethiopic, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for whom it is canonical scripture. But substantial portions in Aramaic were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran following 1947, and these manuscripts have been paleographically and epigraphically dated by scholars to roughly the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC. Multiple copies were found across multiple caves. This was not a marginal text circulating in isolated communities. By every available measure, the Watcher tradition preserved in First Enoch was mainstream reading in Second Temple Judaism. The opening section of First Enoch, known as the Book of the Watchers, takes Genesis 6:1-4 as its launching point and builds it into a full narrative. The Watchers take their name from an Aramaic root for the unsleeping or the ever-wakeful, a term the Book of Daniel uses independently to describe a particular class of heavenly official in the divine court, one that carries formal administrative weight in the ancient Near Eastern conception of the heavenly realm. In First Enoch, they are heavenly beings who observe human women from above, desire them, and resolve to descend. Their leader is named Shemihaza. They gather on Mount Hermon, the great snow-capped peak marking the northern boundary of the Promised Land, and swear a mutual oath so that no single being bears the guilt of the transgression alone. Then they descend. The children of these unions are described as beings of enormous scale. The text strains toward hyperbole in conveying their dimensions, who strip the land bare of its provisions and then turn their violence against humanity itself. One of the Watchers, Azazel, is credited with passing forbidden knowledge into human hands. The craft of weapon forging and the art of ornamentation. The world descends into corruption and bloodshed so thorough that the cries of humanity reach the heavenly court. The flood in this telling is the direct divine response. God sends the archangels to bind the Watchers, consign them to darkness, and prepare the earth for cleansing. The relevance of this text to the New Testament is not marginal. The letter of Jude, a short letter near the end of the New Testament canon, directly quotes from First Enoch in verses 14 and 15, attributing the words explicitly to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. And in verse 6, Jude refers to angels who did not keep their own domain but abandoned their proper dwelling, and who are now held in eternal chains in deepest darkness, awaiting the judgment of the great day. The second letter of Peter makes a closely parallel statement in chapter 2, verse 4. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into chains in darkness, consigned to be kept for judgment. These are texts in the New Testament, and they appear to assume the angelic reading of Genesis 6. On the question of physical remains, the direct answer is that mainstream archaeology has not confirmed the existence of unusually large ancient human beings connected to the Nephilim traditions of the Hebrew Bible. Claims of giant skeletal discoveries in the Levant or Arabia circulate widely and persistently online. In virtually every documented case on record, those claims can be traced to misidentified remains, digitally manipulated photographs, or wholly fabricated reports. No peer-reviewed discovery of skeletal evidence representing a population of unusual stature linked to the biblical Nephilim has been published or confirmed. What archaeology has confirmed is the deep cultural currency of this tradition. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 1947 in the caves above Qumran, contained Aramaic manuscripts of portions of the Book of the Watchers from 1st Enoch, which paleographers and epigraphers widely date to roughly the late 3rd or early 2nd century BC, the earliest surviving physical evidence for this material. The same caves yielded fragments of the Book of Giants, a related text that elaborated the Watcher narrative further. Multiple copies, multiple caves. The physical evidence establishes that this tradition was not esoteric or marginal within Second Temple Judaism. It was widespread. The linguistic debate over the key terms remains active and unresolved. Scholars including Michael Heiser have argued on lexicographic grounds that bene ha-elohim must be understood as referring to divine beings, given the consistent usage of the phrase across the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and that the Sethite interpretation, however theologically convenient, cannot be sustained from the text as written. Others, working from patristic or reformed interpretive frameworks, maintain the Sethite reading as both exegetically defensible and theologically coherent. These are not casual disagreements. Both positions are held by scholars working seriously with the primary sources. This is live scholarly debate, not a question the historical record has settled. What is not in dispute is this: 4 verses generated more interpretive energy in antiquity than almost any other passage of comparable length in the Hebrew Bible. The texts produced in response, the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Giants, the language of Jude and Peter, centuries of rabbinic and patristic engagement, are the evidence. Whatever the original author intended, these verses refuse to remain small. Genesis 6:1-4 does not tell us who the sons of God were. It does not explain the Nephilim. It does not describe what happened to them. It states 4 things and moves forward. That refusal to explain is part of what makes the passage so persistent. Something in these verses touches a question that human beings have carried across every era. What lies at the boundary of the human world? What happens when that boundary is breached? And what does the violence and disorder that follows say about the nature of the world the flood was sent to wash clean? And perhaps more quietly, about the nature of the world we still inhabit. The Nephilim were mighty men, men of renown. The text says so and then falls silent. What they were, where they came from, and whether anything of them carried through the waters. The text leaves all of that open across every generation for the reader to sit with. If this story has stayed with you, Bible Stories Unearthed has a growing library of e-books that go deeper into the archaeology and history behind the biblical world. You'll find the link to our Amazon author page in the description below. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.